Hello everybody, Dr. Alex Vasquez coming to you live right now to talk about part number 6 in this series on pharmacology that I started last month, the pharmacology of vitamin B12. As some of you know who have seen the previous videos, I eventually changed the focus of this topic from pharmacology to metabolic detoxification, and right now I want to talk to you about methylmalonic acid and how that relates to B12 as a model of metabolic detoxification. So let's start by talking about the basic physiology and pharmacology, starting with the absorption of vitamin B12. So obviously we start with acquisition, mastication, digestion, which requires the parietal cells in the stomach because they secrete hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. We then have to have pancreatic enzymes. We need to have a good eubiosis and avoidance of dysbiosis within the gastrointestinal tract, specifically no small intestine bacterial overgrowth, and a good ileum that's not affected by surgical resection, Crohn's disease, celiac disease, or small intestine bacterial overgrowth. From there, we absorb B12 in the terminal ileum, and we can use high-dose supplementation, typically 2 to 6 milligrams per day of vitamin B12, or we can use injections, either intravenous, subcutaneous, or intramuscular. Now we've got B12 in the blood, and the biologically available form of B12 is called holotranscobalamin, and that indicates that it's B12 bound to the transcobalamin protein. This enters the cells through a transcobalamin receptor and then enters the lysozyme, which removes the transcobalamin protein, leaving us with unbound cobalamin. Now you can see here that I've also indicated certain proteins that function as transporters, but they also have a little bit of enzymatic activity because they actually change the form of vitamin B12 as well. So mostly they're transport proteins. Some of them have a little bit of enzymatic activity as well. So again, once we have B12 inside the cell, after it's been received by the transcobalamin receptor, it enters the lysozyme so that the transcobalamin protein can be removed. Now we have B12 being transported by these transport proteins that have a little bit of enzymatic activity. The most commonly mutated of these proteins is called CBLC. And at this point, the B12 molecule is going to take one of two routes. The first route that I've indicated here is the conversion to methylcobalamin, which is required for the enzyme methionine synthase, which plays a part in the folate cycle, but also, of course, plays a part in the methionine cycle because our goal is to get rid of or recycle homocysteine. So homocysteine, as you should know, is neurotoxic, vasculotoxic, and osteotoxic. So we can see that this is a metabolite, a toxic metabolite that has to be detoxified through the provision of adequate nutrition, in this case, folic acid, B12, B6, betaine, and at times, acetylcysteine or N-acetylcysteine. What I want to focus on right now in today's presentation is the metabolism of events that occurs up here, and so let's dive into that and take a look. So the other route for B12, other than getting converted into methylcobalamin, is its conversion into adenylcobalamin. Adenylcobalamin is the cofactor for the enzyme methylmalonyl-CoA mutase, which converts L-methylmalonyl into succinyl-CoA, which gets metabolized, or we might say burnt off, within the Krebs cycle or the citrate cycle within the mitochondria. So whereas the events down here are occurring within the cytoplasm, all the events up here are occurring within the mitochondria. So what I want us to focus in on is that we have to get rid of some of these toxic metabolites or these toxic intermediates. L-methylmalonyl-CoA has to get converted by this enzyme, methylmalonyl-CoA, which requires vitamin B12 in the form of adenylcobalamin. We have to get rid of this metabolite with this enzyme, otherwise it's going to accumulate into something called methylmalonic acid. For many years, we considered methylmalonic acid to be inactive, but we now know that it is neuroinflammatory, that it causes mitochondrial dysfunction, and that it also promotes tumor growth. So previously, my opinion on this lab test for methylmalonic acid is that it was perhaps overused, but certainly not necessary in the treatment of common B12 deficiency. And I still think that that's mostly true. I'll talk about that more in just a moment. But what I want us to do right now is look at methylmalonic acid not as an innocent bystander or byproduct that elevates with B12 deficiency, but rather an indicator of unwellness and unhealthy aging, specifically as it causes neuroinflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, and promotes tumor growth. The original source for L-methylmalonyl-CoA is propionyl-CoA, which comes from propionic acid. Propionic acid is produced from the gut anaerobic bacterial fermentation of carbohydrates. Also, certain amino acids, including valine, methionine, isoleucine, and threonine, and also odd-chain fatty acids. So those are the sources of propionic acid, which gets converted into propionyl-CoA. If we don't get rid of propionyl-CoA, that's called propionic acidemia, and that can be a life-threatening condition. Propionyl-CoA carboxylase is the enzyme that detoxifies the metabolite propionyl-CoA, and this enzyme requires biotin as a cofactor. And this is why we use biotin as a nutritional supplement, is to support the activity of propionyl-CoA carboxylase to get rid of this toxic intermediate or this toxic metabolite called propionyl-CoA. Systemic accumulation of propionic acid is a life-threatening condition. So we have to convert propionyl-CoA into methylmalonyl-CoA. However, at the start of this conversion, propionyl-CoA is converted by propionyl-CoA carboxylase into the D isomer of methylmalonyl-CoA. This enzyme, methylmalonyl-CoA mutase, only functions against L-methylmalonyl-CoA. So we have to use an enzyme, abbreviated here as MCEE, which is methylmalonyl-CoA epimerase, and that converts the D isomer of methylmalonyl-CoA into the L isomer of methylmalonyl-CoA so that it can be detoxified by methylmalonyl-CoA mutase, which requires adenosylcobalamin as one of the forms of vitamin B12. So again, if a patient makes too much propionic acid because they have gut dysbiosis, they're going to accumulate propionyl-CoA, which then has to get detoxified. If the patient has a defect